Welcome everyone to a Turbulence Zone. In this session, together with my colleague Florence Gaup, we will take you through what 2021 might look like or will look like in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm not an expert in the region, but what strikes me usually when we look at the reporting about the events across Middle East and North Africa is how badly we are usually prepared to deal with what's happening. And our response times is usually not what everybody would like to see. And I cannot really think of a better person to talk this issue through than our local and in-house expert of global reach, I should say, Florence Gaup. Welcome, Florence, to the studio. As you can see, we are connecting with you from two different locations in Paris and in Brussels. So please forgive any potential glitches. I should also invite you at this stage to join the conversation throughout the session. You can submit your questions or comments either on the YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag EU4Side. Florence, as I said, when we talk about the region, I think we usually talk about the region that runs on surprise rather than on schedule. And I was wondering whether you could maybe take us a bit through some of those issues that you actually think might be on schedule rather than unexpected throughout 2021.
Thanks, Patrick. So, of course, we have some things that are scheduled, but as you said, most of this year will probably be, again, surprise. Now, we have two types of elections scheduled. For one, the first type I would call conflict-solving elections. Whether they do that is a separate story. And the second type is, regular policy process type of election. Now, the first type of election, the conflict solvers, they are going to take place in Syria, in Libya at the end of the year, also in Iraq, earlier elections. But you could also consider the Algerian elections that will take place after electoral reform to have the purpose of, as I said, solving a conflict in society. Now, for all of you who thought that elections are great to solve conflicts, they don't. They have a really bad track record. First, you have to actually solve the conflict and then go to the polls. But we will have these scheduled for this year. And then we have the more regular elections taking place in Israel and Iran and also in Morocco. Now, Israel and Iran, we don't expect any revolutionary changes here. In both cases, we think that the conservatives will win. In Israel, even if it's without Netanyahu, I think we will have a right-wing winner. And then in Morocco, this could be quite interesting. This is the second time Moroccans are going to the poll after the constitutional reform following the Arab Spring. So if anything, I think this could be a very interesting election, or an interesting election to watch.
And there are also some leadership changes, I think, when we look at the regional organizations, right? I think the Arab League is expected to change the leadership.
So it's true that the mandate for the League of Arab States, SecGen, is up for renewal in the spring. Now, the tradition has been ever since it was created in 1945 that this is an Egyptian. This is not written anywhere, so it could also be somebody else. And we've been suspecting for a while now that one of the Gulf states might make a push for this post. Now, of course, the League of Arab States is not in itself the big geopolitical ticket here, but should, for instance, the UAE make a move on this, this could indeed have a signaling effect. It would signal that the Gulf states, or the UAE in this case, really has the intention to shape regional matters. This would actually also chime well with the UAE's Expo 2020, which of course has been postponed to this year. And this is the first of its kind in the region. The UAE really intends to use this to showcase itself to be the powerhouse of the regional future. So these are also things that are on the agenda.
Great. So that's the people on the horizon and what might be happening for 2021 in those countries. But let's talk maybe a bit about the issues and where do you potentially see some main changes, continuities, or what might be those big developments that people who will be in power will influence in one way or the other?
So unfortunately, we have this conversation. We had it last year. We had it the year before. There are some deeply, deeply protracted issues in the region that will require responses that even if these responses are taken this year, we will not see the direct effects. These three are, well, firstly, civil unrest, connected to the second point, economy, and the third point, insecurity. Now, civil unrest, there is long COVID. There's also the long Arab Spring, if you want. We had, of course, the first big wave in 2011, but in 2019, we had a whole range of smaller waves, in Algeria, but also in Lebanon and in Iraq. And this continues. It also continued last year through the pandemic. So we can be sure that in 2021, we will see civil unrest again in these states, but perhaps also in others. My guess would be before the summer or in the run-up to the summer, because as temperatures get higher, the poor state of services becomes particularly apparent. Power cuts, delayed waste removal, water pollution, and so forth are all issues that really brought Iraqis on the street. Because Baghdad last year had its highest temperature ever with 52 degrees. I've experienced this. I can tell you the body is not made for this.
And I think those who are more interested in checking this relationship between insecurity in the region and the heat can also look into one of the briefs that you have prepared for the UISS. But let's continue on the topic of insecurity. Throughout 2020, most of us lived in lockdown. Was ISIS in lockdown too? What other security issues are there in the region that have sort of influenced the policies, and probably something that we are going to see throughout 2021 as well?
It's funny that you say that. Lockdown, ISIS was definitely not in lockdown. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was, some message from ISIS circulated, according to which ISIS told its supporters to stay at home and to not come to Europe. But in reality, ISIS has had a very, very active year last year. It stepped up attacks in Syria by 20% compared to the year before. In Iraq, it managed to stage 3 attacks per year. In Europe, it also increased it a little bit to globally 6, if I count correctly. So really, whoever thinks that ISIS is a problem of the past is just not in tune with what's going on. So what's going to happen this year? We do predict that because in addition to what's already going on, we have the removal or the withdrawal of the last American troops from Iraq. So if you think this all sounds very 2010, it does. Which I think the signal will be to Islamic State that the Iraqi space is up for grabs again. So definitely watch the Iraqi space, but also Syria. We can particularly expect this for Ramadan because ISIS really, really focuses its efforts on there. So that will be from mid-April to mid-May onwards. Patrick, can I perhaps say something about the economy? Because I know we prepared a little bit of a graphic, and I think it's useful for the audience to see also how COVID actually impacted the region and where the vulnerabilities are. So you can see here the huge dip, that's Libya. So, COVID doesn't affect people in the same way, and it doesn't affect economies in the same way. You can see states like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they're doing okay, in some cases even better than European states. I mean, they're not great, but better than us. But then you have states like Lebanon, like Tunisia. I mean, these are always the usual suspects. The war economies in particular that have really, really suffered. Libya's economy shrunk by 40%. And I should say also, even for Egypt, who's been doing comparatively well, don't fall into the 2010 trap where the numbers were also looking in terms of GDP growth rather okay. Youth unemployment is the same. It stayed at 30% for over a decade, except that the absolute pool of people that now are unemployed has grown. So I think this feeds perhaps also into this, larger issue of civil unrest, insecurity. So the pool of people that are just really angry is growing by the day.
That's great. And I think the connection that you are making between insecurity and the economy is something that we definitely have to watch, especially if you look at developments in countries like Lebanon. But Florence, any good news coming from the regions for those of us who like to look at the world through maybe a bit more pink glass than think about negative all the time?
Well, you know me. I've been called a real optimist, so I always try to look at where the opportunities are. So of course I have to warn of these things, and I'll come back to why I do that. But yes, let's look at what the options are. So I think what the possibilities are. The first thing is the regional landscape has definitely changed at the end of last year. On the one hand, the end of the Qatar crisis, and on the other, the Abraham Accords. Israel has now normalized relations with almost half of Arab states. So does that mean that everything is good? No, but it means that battle royale is over. This interlude of everybody against everybody, and it opens the possibility for multilateralism. And as you know, the region has so many problems that are trans-regional. Be it the perception of Iran, or be it climate change, the list goes on. And for the EU, this is good news because we like the multilateral format. We are, if you want, a multilateral format. So I think there is some good news there. And I would also say that perhaps there's been a gentle nudge, not a massive nudge, but a gentle nudge towards digitalization as well. So, this is perhaps a good window of opportunity to move towards a different type of economy.
So you spoke a bit about the economy, insecurity in the region, also how the international environment is changing. And you mentioned that some of these information and news might be a positive development for the EU. What those trajectories mean for the EU when we look at the bigger picture? Where do we think the EU should see certain opportunities, or where maybe there are risks that we should be already monitoring in order to be better prepared throughout the year?
So that, of course, the very term that we use in EU lingo for this region is neighborhood. So it's not just a geographic term. I think it really expresses that these are the people that are next to us. These are the regions that are next to us, and as such, they have primary importance for us. So from the 2003 strategy onwards, the EU's goal was always to create a peaceful, prosperous, a stable neighborhood, or not create, but to contribute to, for its own good, not just altruistic reasons. And we've been swimming against the current for a long time now. And the real problem here is, and this is, I think, the risk that I'd like to point out, is that there is a danger that the EU, but also European leaders, try to fix these really protracted problems with short-term solutions. And if you want, we've had a decade of short-term solutions, a decade of one-year approaches. So 10 times 1 year does not solve the problem. But all of these problems that I just touched upon, civil unrest, so civil discontent really, insecurity, poor economic performance, these are all issues that require really deep and long-term solutions. And I think, so this is the first big risk, to try to fix something within a year that cannot be fixed within a year. But, sorry, Patrick, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think the idea of short-termism that you have mentioned is quite interesting because, many of the issues and challenges you have discussed, we see them coming back time and time again. And yet the responses that seem to be coming out do not address this long-term solution. So I was wondering, and I think this is probably $1 million or €1 million question, how do we actually switch this mentality from thinking about short-termism to maybe a more sustainable solution? Where do you look for the answers?
So I think the first thing is to understand that there is no photo op here. There is no quick fix, and I think that's as the EU, we're quite used to that because we tend to go into longer term things and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's not rocket science. Civil unrest, you need better representation. Poor economic performance, you need to get out of the current economic model and transition to the economic model of the future: digital, green, localized, and knowledge-based. And so these states haven't really done yet. Again, there are some exceptions, but overall, I would say it's still very much a 1990s economic model. So this needs to be done. And of course, we mentioned these three problems, but we're heading towards an iceberg, although here the picture really doesn't hold because it's climate change. And the region, the Middle East, North Africa, I cannot stress this enough, is the region in the world that will become the hottest because of climate change. And we see already the ripple effects. I mentioned the Baghdad heat wave, and there needs to be awareness. There need to be measures in place to secure these societies against those effects that cannot be avoided, and to contribute to cutting of CO2. Because while we have been decreasing CO2 emissions, the Middle East, North Africa has increased. It's almost now at the levels of Europe. So none of these are easy diplomatic wins. So there is really, if you want to become famous, perhaps don't try it here. But if you really want to change something for the better, come in with a longer term view, with deep reform, and identify those partners in the region that are willing towards these goals. At the end of the day, it's the leaders in the region that have to make these decisions. It's obviously not up to us, but there are those that are willing to look into these changes and make these painful steps forward.
I think there is a certain paradox in what we're discussing here, because on one hand, you just called for a long-term vision in thinking about the region, but at the same time, we know that we do not really have much time left, especially when we talk about issues like climate change. So I'm wondering, and I know you have done a lot of thinking on this, including for the Arab Futures reports, where do you think the EU should step in? Where are those opportunities that we can grasp already in 2021? Thinking long term, but acting already now in order to make sure that we do not wake up too late.
So, to end things, or not to end things, but to come to a bit of a more constructive position on this. So I think as the EU, we've always had, our unique selling point, our advantage really is that we have pretty long policy cycles. We can actually make these longer term commitments, and we have a really good record when it comes to these longer term reforms. So I think ultimately it's pretty much the same that we're doing here now. Europe is now on a trajectory to future-proof itself. So be it against climate change, but also its economy and so forth. And we have to offer the same to the states in the region. So I'm thinking, of course, climate change. I'm also thinking the economy. Generation Alpha. I'll talk about that in a second. They don't want to be waiters at Club Med. It's not just about jobs. It's about jobs with meaning. It's about jobs that people actually want to do. And I think perhaps when you look at the numbers, we've been too obsessed with numbers when actually we should look at quality. So I think that's something, which brings me to Generation Alpha. Everybody knows now what the millennials are, but we have forgotten that right behind them is actually a new generation of younger people. So Generation Alpha, and they actually are different from their predecessors because they've been even more digitalized. They have concerns about society. They've lived through conflict. They've been affected by conflict much more than their preceding generations. Reaching out to this generation, creating opportunities for startups, help them realize their professional dreams, make them ready for the labor market, be it English skills, tech skills, access to microloans and so forth. And then, of course, also perhaps help them form platforms, because one of the problems we saw after the Arab Spring was that we had a lot of anger, but we didn't have organizations that could really, representative organizations of younger people that could actually transmit in a constructive way to the political leadership, this is what we want, and this is what we propose, how we can get it. And it's these platforms that are missing. And I think, there can be a lot done, I think, also with social media, with digital platforms and so forth. I think that's a know-how we can transfer.
Thanks for this very constructive observations and suggestions, Florence. I don't want to monopolize the discussion, and I think we already have several questions for you from our audience. So I would like to give them the opportunity to have the answers. I think we have three groups of questions that I'm looking at. One focusing more on the elections, the second one on the reforms in some of the countries, and finally a bit of a geopolitical conversation. Let me start maybe with a very specific election-linked question. And I warned you that our participants and viewers are taking you for a tour of the whole region. So we will be jumping from one end to another. Let's start with Libyan elections. What outcomes to expect from Libyan elections? While there are not state institutions to enforce the results like in 2014?
So the Libyan elections, well, of course, they take place at the end of the year. If they take place, they will be preceded by a whole range of consultative processes. What I would hope, so the election outcome depends very much on this process. This is what I said earlier, that elections, are not a magic wand to solve a conflict. So if we go to let's assume the best case scenario, we've had a very good constructive process, then I would hope that we have a election setup that is very localized, because we want to get out of the logic of Islamists versus non-Islamists, Tobruk versus Tripoli, and so forth. So in my dream, we would have localized elections, municipal elections, where people really vote for people that are from that locality and that represent themselves. And then we can have actually, in an almost ironical reference to the Jamahiriya, a system that is, from localized further up, and perhaps in a way depoliticize or de-ideologize the elections to come back to actually, really issues of governance rather than ideology. So that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is, of course, that we have same of today, where we have these rivalries split along not even pure ideological lines, but on lines of power grabbing, really. And then we are, it's Groundhog Day all over. We'll be sitting here in 2022 and have pretty much the same conversation.
There are a few questions going as well in the direction of structural reforms in some of the countries that you already covered. And there are two in particular. Will the Lebanese public find a new way of organizing politically to overcome their political order? I think that's particularly relevant in the context of the news. We hear about the COVID situation and the impact on the country's economy, but also a question about Iraq. Can structural reforms realistically be expected in Iraq to fix the current currency and political issues? Different countries, but I think the underlying problems that these questions are pointing to are similar ones. And we have about 5 minutes, so if I can ask you to be very brief, we have one more or two more questions to follow up with.
Well, let me group them together. I think for Lebanon, I think this might not be a popular thing to say, but I always felt, I was there in October 2019 when the unrest started. And I felt, okay, people are really upset, but at the end of the day, are they questioning the core of the system? And the core of the system, I'm afraid, is the confessional representation of governance. As long as that is not fundamentally questioned by the public, as long as we don't have demonstrations where people say, "Khalas, we don't want the Taif agreement anymore," I think the elites will not feel in any way put under pressure to change, because they feel that they represent their particular group in society, and that is their legitimacy. So I think I'm afraid until the Lebanese themselves are ready to question the political system as a whole, we'll get more band-aids on bigger problems. In Iraq, I think the problem is more protracted because we have huge insecurity. We have one of the most corrupt countries in the region, I think just behind Yemen. So here we would need a real revolution to have the leadership understand that the elections are perhaps one way forward. We have Sadr playing perhaps a constructive, perhaps a not so constructive role. One never really knows with him. But I think that fundamentally, here as well, the leadership needs to understand that without, as I said, revolutionary approach to corruption, we will see the same thing all over again.
And I promised you a question that focuses a bit more on geopolitics of the region. So here it is, and it's also closer to home, I think. And what do you expect from the attitude of Turkey in the region in 2021? Do you expect it to calm down with the new year's administration taking over? Or do you think that Turkey will continue with its attempts to influence the region, participate in the conflict? In other words, what should we be expecting from Turkey in 2021?
What I would like to happen, what I would like to see a year from now when we have this conversation again, is that Turkey understood, as other states in the region, that with the Biden administration now there, that the regional tone is a different one. This battle royale, everybody against everybody, should be over. I think that Turkey will continue to play a role in the region. I think its relationship with Qatar has really grown throughout the crisis. It will also not just withdraw from Libya. But I hope that, given the larger tone that is set, just by having a more nuanced and more civilized approach, that doors of opportunities are being opened. And I hope Turkey will go through them. I think what we will see at the bare minimum is a change in rhetoric. I think this incendiary rhetoric will calm down a bit because it's no longer as acceptable. But Turkey, I think, has a few things on its to-do list, be it Libya, be it Qatar, and some relationship building to do with its neighbors.
And Florence, to conclude, one last question that you always push us to try to think about. Are there any disruptive events or uncertainties that you think will impact the analysis that you have just shared with us?
Well, really, in this case, I think the big uncertainty or the big disruptive event would be if leaders in the region wake up and really take matters into their own hands, because it's really up to them to make all these changes.
Great. Thank you, Florence.
Thanks, Patrick.
We are slowly running out of time, so let me just wrap it up. I think it was a very useful tour of the horizon of what to expect in 2021. So nothing else expected from you, Florence. I think everybody else watching us, please remember that we have just published the new publication on the UIS's website, What If Not? So we departing a bit from what if's tradition of telling you what if things happen. Actually, what should we expect if certain of the things we would like to see as analysts do not materialize? What are the long-term consequences of those? And that publication has been massively masterfully edited by Florence with contributions from my colleagues. So I invite you to have a look at that. Thank you for joining us. Please follow up with the discussions on Africa, conflict and defense that will be taking place this afternoon. And of course, my own session on cyber that will take place at 1500 this afternoon. Thank you very much for watching.